Okay, A block, second set of questions. Are upper class Nepali women also seen as unclean during menstruation and childbirth? Um, Nepal is very diverse, and it has some small Muslim minority populations, Buddhist populations, and Hindu populations, and they all have different beliefs around childbirth. And for example, in the rural areas, they tend to be more, in the rural hilly areas, they tend to be more Hindu, and there are specific beliefs associated with that. Certainly, some of these beliefs also are found in urban areas, definitely. And I know Nepali men who in their household, the women don't sleep in the household if they're menstruating, for example. But I think it's fair to say that the urban areas are generally more progressive, if you like, and these kind of traditional beliefs are likely less prevalent. But I say that only anecdotally, and to really understand, of course, you need to do research, and most of the research that we have done has been focused on rural areas where the highest levels of maternal mortality are found. So I think the honest answer is I don't know. You asked about my job and help women's rights. That's a really excellent question. There are a lot of very technical interventions that you can do, for example, setting up transport funds in a village so that women can get to hospital and that there are funds available when there's an emergency. But as your question alludes to, they don't really solve the root of the problem, and the root of the problem is really around women's rights and attitudes to women and the status of women in society. And so what we try and do is, rather than implementing these kind of projects as a standalone separate intervention, we try and bring them all under an umbrella of women's rights. And so we create women's groups all over Nepal. And in those women's groups, we try and empower women, or help women empower themselves to overcome some of these barriers. And there have been some spectacular examples of success of this women's group model in Nepal and in India. For example, where women are at risk of violence, and that violence is linked to the use of alcohol by men, there are villages in India where the women have all got together and formed a kind of union and have managed to ban alcohol from the entire region. So men can't drink, and we find that the rate of violence against those women reduces dramatically. Similarly, in Nepal, women's groups have been very successful in trying to address these issues. If the women themselves organise the emergency transport funds, they lobby the men, and they use their collective power to overcome some of these issues. It's very interesting in the data we get from Nepali women. Whilst they are incredibly downtrodden and they have incredibly hard lives, there is a sense of injustice there, which is really important, because if women just accept their fate, if you like, there's a lot of work to do to change those attitudes amongst women before you can start to support them in actually changing the reality on the ground. Whereas if women are aware that they are exploited and they are have a very difficult and inequitable situation, then that's a foundation for doing something about it. And what's really interesting is that the Maoist movement in Nepal, which was fighting for the rights of poor rural people for decades in Nepal, often with guns, it was an armed movement, and a lot of women members formed key roles within that movement, and that's had a very interesting impact on women's rights in Nepal, and probably a significantly positive impact in empowering women, in that there was a very powerful movement that did allow women to rise to positions of power and influence, which is unheard of in any other sphere in Nepal. I think there are a lot of problems with that movement for women as well, which I won't go into now. How many women accept their place in society, and do any of them speak out against it? Well, I think I to some extent answered that question. How do you deal with the language barrier between you and your respondents? That's a really excellent question. We obviously, through the key informant method, we ask people in the community to go and interview the women, and then we have Nepali social scientists who interview our key informants, and that data is then translated by a professional translator into English for me and other consultants to analyse. Now, what I'm sure you're thinking, quite rightly, is doesn't that introduce lots of uncertainty into the data analysis? And it does, it's really true. It's very, very hard as an outsider to really understand the realities of for women in Nepal. You can imagine trying to understand it from the page, however good your data is, you're still a million miles away from understanding it as a Nepali woman would understand it herself. And the key answer to that problem is to train social scientists in developing countries so they can analyse their own data, because they're closer to the language, closer to the realities on the ground. And one of the things that we have tried to do is build local capacity in universities to use this kind of method, so that the quality of the data analysis and the usefulness of the findings is maximised. What happens after women give birth? Do they have to stay outside? Do you know offhand? I'm not sure. Generally, there's a ritual associated with childbirth, and women are confined inside for, I think, 2 weeks or 10 days after giving birth. And then there is a cleansing ceremony where a local religious leader will come in and cleanse the house, often with sprinkling cow urine around the house. And there are a lot of beliefs in Nepali society around the beneficial properties of cows, and there are certain rituals that they'll do to cleanse the woman, to cleanse the house, and then after a period of time the woman is considered spiritually clean. But this has other implications of the ability of women to reach medical services, etc. There's a lot of literature on that, which I haven't got time to go into now. Do Nepali men reject this poor treatment? Well, yes, of course. There are a lot of middle-class, educated men who work in Nepali NGOs and for organisations that are fighting for the rights of women. ActionAid, for example, has been very active in fighting for women's rights in Nepal. But we're trying to work on a population level. We're working with, a country of millions and millions of people, and trying to encourage cultural change in such a large population is extremely difficult. And of course, you have to work with both men and women. And I would say that we're a long way away from changing men's attitudes in Nepal. Are you aware of any campaigns for equal rights? Yes, there are a lot of campaigns in Nepal for equal rights. And do you feel that with increasing global communications there will be more women's rights? Well, in Nepal, I think it's fair to say that technology has been quite slow to penetrate into rural areas. Nepal is very unusual because of the topography of the region, very, very hilly, mountainous and hard to reach areas. Means very poor education, very limited literacy amongst women, and therefore their access to technology for both men and women, but particularly women, because they tend to get a lower quality education and worse access to education, is a real problem. But certainly in the flat areas and in the urban areas, like anywhere else, there is a real technological revolution going on in Nepal. An interesting question is, how would you answer that question? You would need to do research, so you would start looking at do women and men have equal access to technology? How many male and female internet users are there in Nepal? What kind of use of the internet are they making? That kind of thing. And that would require separate research, which it might be interesting to discuss how you would do it. My sense is obviously information technology has huge potential, but you need a basic level of literacy, and Nepali women have particularly low levels of literacy, and the access to primary education, basic literacy skills, is a prerequisite for the next level, which is access to IT, and so that would be the second step, if you like. I think that's it for the first set of questions.